This podcast is best listened to on an over-ear audio device. The following introduction is based on a true story. It had been just 24 hours and change since the devastating terror attacks on September 11th, 2001. 4 hijacked airliners, commandeered by 19 al-Qaeda terrorists, had forever altered the American landscape. The World Trade Center in New York, once a symbol of global commerce and American success, lay in ruins. The 7-building complex had been left entirely unrecognizable after 2 of the hijacked airliners slammed into the Twin Towers. The air was thick with the stench of death, jet fuel, and burning electronics that mingled with the haze that blanketed the city. A defiant plume of smoke stretched high above Manhattan and Brooklyn, a dark reminder of the tragedy. In the civilian harbors as far as Jamaica Bay and Breezy Point in southern Brooklyn, boat owners frantically scrubbed the thin film of grainy dust coating their vessels, finding eerie reminders of daily life. Papers marking notarized depositions and stock certificates, relics of a world they once knew. The same could be said for the ordinary citizens of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, who remained shuttered inside their homes or evacuated elsewhere. Along State Route 1007, the homeowners had long departed. Just a few football fields east, hijacked United Airlines Flight 93 had impacted the empty field of an old quarry at nearly the speed of sound, leaving trees singed and aircraft debris in their backyards. The classic white American picket fences had been roped off with crime scene tape, and the NTSB and FBI agents scoured the green Kentucky bluegrass and flower beds for plane parts. 200 miles east, emergency crews were still trying to put out the constant fires inside the Pentagon, the headquarters of the United States military in Washington, D.C. The Pentagon had been struck by American Airlines Flight 77, leaving a gaping hole in the building and a massive column of smoke rising into the sky. Emergency workers and federal agents scoured the lawn for plane parts, making out the sleek but charred remains of the fuselage of the Boeing 757. An evidence pile stood under a large white easy-up tent, with one large piece of fuselage plastered with the C of the iconic American red Helvetica font. The city looked like a war zone. Litter skipped across the deserted streets, and tanks blockaded Independence Avenue. An abandoned car parked off kilter on State Route 27 adjacent to the Pentagon, its hazards on and its windshield smashed in by a light pole that the wing of the incoming hijacked Flight 77 had knocked down. The only thing that filled the sky was an occasional fighter jet, so close to the ground you could make out the face of the Air Force pilot inside. Suddenly, the ground shook and the agents and rescue workers stared up at the sky, fearing yet another terrorist strike. Seconds later, a white Gulfstream private jet descended above the Pentagon towards Joint Base Andrews. The people on the Pentagon lawn breathed a sigh of relief. On board the private jet were some of the highest-ranking people in the British intelligence community. Chief of MI6 Richard Dearlove, Deputy Chief of MI5 Eliza Manningham-Buller, and David Manning, British Prime Minister Tony Blair's chief foreign policy advisor. Although they had arrived on an overwhelmingly mournful and unfortunate occasion, they came to personally advise on how to fight domestic terrorism best and offer their condolences. The British, the United States' closest ally, had watched nervously in the hours after the attacks to see how President George W. Bush would respond to these grave threats to world peace. And so the intelligence staff jumped into a massive motorcade at Joint Base Andrews, guarded by what looked like hundreds of soldiers with automatic rifles, and made their way to the George H.W. Bush Center for Intelligence to meet with CIA Director George Tenet and Cofer Black, the CIA's Director of Counterterrorism Center, as well as a big gathering of other high-ranking American officials in the intelligence community. As the silverware clinked and the plates shook, the British representatives and intelligence agents stood up with champagne glasses to give their toast. Aside from the expected thoughts and prayers, David Manning stood up and made his speech. He vowed that the United States and Great Britain would work together on this new terrorist threat. He finished with one last remark. I hope we can all agree that we should concentrate on Afghanistan and not launch any attacks against Iraq.
We also have to work the dark side, if you will. We're going to spend time in the shadows in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in, and so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal.
Welcome back to another installment of the Human Factor Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Delahaye. Today, we will embark on a sobering yet controversial journey about the notorious United States campaign known as the War on Terror. 9/11 changed America as we know it. Aside from society being rudimentally transformed, the American citizenry lost faith in the United States government because of the seemingly meaningless and endless wars that followed, which became an everlasting stain on American pride in the 21st century. The loss of faith in the government by its citizens led to paranoia, hysteria, and the massive growth of misinformation, all of which we still experience today. The War on Terror failed for several reasons: unclear objectives, failure to address the root causes of 9/11, and the massive loss of public opinion and moral depreciation by the United States political administration. Today, we will explore how these effects came into play, discussing the roots of the War on Terror in Afghanistan with the rise of the brutal Taliban regime. Chapter 1: Roots. The War on Terror was not born out of the rubble of the World Trade Center and Pentagon, or the soil of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, but rather the rugged foothills of the Hindu Kush in the 1990s. Although the 9/11 attacks served as a significant catalyst for the War on Terror, the seeds of the brutal conflict were sown in Afghanistan, along with the tribes and insurgent groups that inhabited those distant lands, most prominently, the Taliban. The Taliban, which translates literally to students, was founded in the mid-1990s from the ranks of the militia group known as Mujahideen, a CIA-backed resistance group and victors of the Soviet incursion in the 1980s. To truly grasp the evolution of the Taliban and their essential role in the War on Terror, we need to delve deep into the ethnic tapestry and history that is Afghanistan, one that holds a dynamic power struggle that even persists today. Afghanistan, then and now, is still a predominantly tribal nation and resolutely Sunni Muslim. Almost half of the country comprises the Pashtuns, who reside mainly along the Pakistan border and as far west as the Afghan city of Farah. Pashtuns make up the majority of major Afghan cities like Kandahar and Khost. The northern part of Afghanistan comprises a crossroads of Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Turkmen peoples. Afghanistan has long thwarted outside invaders and influencers, such as the Sikhs, Russians, and British. The British statesman Winston Churchill once proclaimed Afghanistan as a graveyard of empires in 1897. However, internally, Afghanistan, for almost its entire existence, has been embroiled in perpetual civil war. Leaders have routinely come and go, leading to power vacuums that culminate in more civil wars. A long pattern in Afghan history presented itself, tribes uniting to repel invaders, only for them to turn their weapons on each other once it was all over. In 1973, the outside world was almost unconcerned when the king of Afghanistan was ousted by his cousin, Mohammad Daoud Khan, in a bloodless coup. This resulted in the short-lived Republic of Afghanistan, which lasted until 1978. Daoud named himself president. Under Daoud's regime, it was anything but democratic or presidential. He fought his political opponents and dissenters fiercely and nationalized almost all private entities. Militia groups such as the Mujahideen resisted his rule but were kept in check for now. It looked like, for a while, Afghanistan would finally enjoy some sort of stability, but he soon made a mistake. He decided to seek aid and assistance from some Western nations. The Soviet Union bordered Afghanistan at the time. The Soviets had always been keen to exert their influence on Afghanistan historically, prominently during the Cold War, to keep a buffer between them and their NATO and Western enemies. However, Daoud's friendliness towards their sworn enemies alarmed Soviet leadership, prompting them to keep a closer eye on the ever-evasive Daoud. After engaging in a short-lived proxy war against neighboring Pakistan, Daoud became increasingly paranoid after multiple failed coup attempts. He cracked down harder than ever before on his political opponents, outlawing all other political parties except his own. He then finally shot himself in the foot. He ousted prominent members of the Parcham faction, a pro-Soviet and communist faction in the Afghan government. This culminated in the Saur Revolution, where armed communist revolutionaries of the Khalq faction, led by Nur Muhammad Taraki, finally overthrew Daoud's regime. With the help of some mutinied members of the Afghan army and aid from the Soviet Union, the coup was successful. Daoud was murdered, and the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was proclaimed. Taraki governed a brutal dictatorship. He ordered the imprisonment and murder of some 30,000 political opponents. He maintained a strong relationship with the Soviet Union, essentially becoming a quasi-satellite state supported by the Kremlin. However, the country once again fell into turmoil. The Taraki regime essentially secularized an inherently Islamic country, vaporizing traditional Islamic ways of life. This angered the Mujahideen even more, who were being covertly supplied with arms by the United States CIA under Operation Cyclone. Eventually, the DRA was on the brink of collapse. Taraki was murdered by members of the communist rival faction known as the Parchamists, led by Hazifullah Amin. Amin continued the brutal repression of the Taraki regime, although with a significant twist that alarmed the Soviets. The Taraki regime had long sought help from the Soviets to maintain law and order in the country. With disarray still in full effect, even with Soviet support, Amin took a different approach as he appealed to the West for help. Alarmed by yet another revolution that could bring about a pro-Western leader, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. The Soviet war in Afghanistan was nothing short of hell on earth. The Soviet army struggled to fight in the rugged terrain of the blood-soaked country. Tank crews, airmen, and infantry regiments struggled to navigate as accurate maps of Afghanistan had never been created before, often dropping bombs in entirely different places. The brutality of the fighting had also never been seen before. Numerous stories exist of brutal events, like a Soviet helicopter crew dragging an Afghan woman into a helicopter, gang raping her, and then proceeding to throw her body out of the helicopter that climbed slowly above the clouds. Mujahideen often rivaled their Soviet enemies in brutality as well. A notorious Mujahid commander known as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar became infamous for his cruelty. He would sever the limbs of Soviet soldiers, throwing their lifeless bodies at the gates of Soviet camps to scare his Soviet counterparts into submission. He also was a budding recipient of United States military aid, a conservative estimate of around $600 million, most of which he supposedly used to organize heroin production and trafficking on a massive scale in the latter years of the war. This became an enormous embarrassment for the United States after this was discovered after the conflict. Mujahideen fought fiercely against the Soviet invaders, using guerrilla warfare tactics and Islamist propaganda to lure disillusioned Muslims from distant lands to fight for their cause. One of the biggest supporters and veterans of this conflict was none other than Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was a Saudi millionaire and resoundingly militant Islamist who financially supported the Mujahideen's efforts throughout the war. He trained young Arab men, most of whom were poor societal outcasts, sending them off into the Hindu Kush with weapons. He also heavily fictionalized the Holy Quran to lure in more men to his cause. Bin Laden also had ambitious plans for the Mujahid resistance against the Soviet incursion. Financed by the CIA and with construction equipment from his father's business empire, a massive cave complex deep in the foothills of the Hindu Kush was constructed, Tora Bora. Chapter 2: The Cloak of Muhammad. The Soviet war in Afghanistan ended in a humiliating defeat for the Red Army in 1989. Once proclaimed in Soviet propaganda as the great civilizers of Afghanistan, shown building churches and schools, they instead left the country in tatters, being welcomed home often as losers with missing limbs. Afghanistan once again fell into disarray. The DRA armies, also fiercely war-torn, became farcical. After a swath of different leaders, Mohammad Najibullah led the country, which was almost as unpopular as the previous leaders of Taraki and Amin. Najibullah now took control of a country in ruin. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and all Soviet aid ran dry. Practically all infrastructure in the country was in ruins, and the government's treasury comprised essentially nothing. The Mujahideen splintered following the Soviet War, plunging the economy into yet another civil conflict. Warlords ruled the countryside and the cities, but a group of young men in Kandahar began making their moves. Kandahar in 1994, to put it lightly, was in ruin. Widespread rape and violence descended onto the lawless city. Warlords frequently restricted daily travel. These warlords even practiced a vile form of sexual slavery known as bakabazi. This frustrated a group of local, young, educated Muslim clergy members known as mullahs, who began meeting to discuss a solution to the problem. The mullahs were taught an ultra-conservative version of madrasa, a type of Islamic education. Inspired by their radical beliefs, they desired to restore Islamic order to the city and restore the glory of the Durrani Pashtuns. They quickly chose their name, the Taliban. Their numbers grew significantly, led by Muhammad Omar, a one-eyed veteran Mujahid general of the Soviet War. A self-proclaimed radical Islamist moderate, Omar valiantly led the Taliban to a decisive victory against other armed insurgents, taking control of vast swaths of southern Afghanistan, most notably the capital, Kabul. His supporters proclaimed him as Commander of the Faithful, as he displayed the supposed cloak of the Prophet Muhammad before a crowd of supporters, a sacred artifact locked away in a shrine. After the Taliban seized control of most of the country, the civil war still dragged on. Ahmad Shah Massoud, a staunchly anti-Taliban revolutionary and Islamic democracy visionary, led a mostly Tajik resistance group in the north of Afghanistan, known as the Northern Alliance. Even though a threat confronted Omar in the north, he grew increasingly reclusive and aloof as he took the reins of his newly proclaimed Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in 1996. He seldom left the Taliban stronghold of Kandahar, and later, in an article by Peter Bergen, declared his capital, Kabul, to be that of Sodom and Gomorrah. Chapter 3: The Regime of Fear and Masters of the House. Despite Omar's reclusive lifestyle, Taliban officials ruled their domain with an iron fist. The Taliban implemented a quasi-religious police state, enforced by the so-called Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. The radio station in Kabul, historically called Radio Kabul, was renamed to The Voice of Sharia, and it constantly spewed Taliban propaganda and an Orwellian form of Sharia law. Every day, simple Western-like activities were banned under the Taliban. Music and movie theaters, even television or anything that depicted a living thing, were strictly forbidden. Men constantly had to have long beards and were frequently beaten, even executed, if not adhered to. The same could be said for women. In the 1970s and prior in Afghanistan, women could roam freely and enjoy Western lifestyles. They did not have to wear the veil and had equal rights, even outlined in the Afghan constitution at the time. As soon as the Taliban took power, women's rights were wholly outlawed and eradicated. Women were excluded entirely from society. They were prohibited from attending school past the 6th grade, receiving health care, and being doctors. Sometime around the same time as the Taliban established their new Orwellian government, a new yet familiar face re-emerged in Afghanistan in May of 1996, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden, a Saudi millionaire, had been a loud and fierce opponent to the presence of United States troops in Saudi Arabia, who remained there after thwarting the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the Gulf War. A staunch anti-Semite, bin Laden believed in a resoundingly militant, fundamentalist, and ultra-conservative form of Wahhabi Sunni Islam, a stark departure in different interpretation from the sacred word of the Prophet Muhammad in the Holy Quran that a majority of Sunni Islamic scholars of today recognize. While most believe that the Taliban and Osama bin Laden held very similar views, which is correct, there is one aspect that sets them apart. The Taliban, who practice similarly perverted and propagandized versions of Quranic principles, were and still are Pashtun nationalists who believe in Islam in one country. Bin Laden, however, was a pan-Islamist who believed in spreading his corrupted interpretation of the Holy Quran to the entire world, as well as slaughtering non-believers he determined to be infidels. While bin Laden's life story and descent into madness can be better explained in my in-depth miniseries, The Writings on the Wall, on the Human Factor YouTube channel, we can still examine just how his relationship with the Taliban truly sparked the War on Terror. In 1996, bin Laden's anti-Saudi, Israeli, and American rhetoric grew increasingly louder. He had been banished from his home country of Saudi Arabia years prior, finding reclusive refuge in the failed state of Sudan, which had been embroiled in a fierce civil war. The African nation was a perfect escape for bin Laden to regroup and grow his Islamic fundamentalist terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. As previously mentioned, numerous sects of the Afghan Mujahideen splintered after the end of the Soviet War in 1989. One of these groups was Al-Qaeda, which was formed in hopes of supporting what bin Laden called Islamist jihads around the world. It held the belief that there was a Judeo-Christian conspiracy to destroy Islam around the world, and they were the only ones to stop it. Al-Qaeda had been responsible for or associated with several small-scale terror attacks in the early 1990s against the United States and the Arabian Peninsula, which caught the eye of the US government, as well as the 1993 World Trade Center bombings, although supposedly not responsible for, was praised by bin Laden. Bin Laden had hoped to drag the United States military into a long, drawn-out insurgency so that he and his holy warriors could humiliate them using the command skills that he learned as a pseudo-general in the Soviet War. Bin Laden was kicked out of his homeland of Saudi Arabia in 1991 after he criticized the Saudi royal family's compliance and so-called subservience to the United States troops stationed in the country to safeguard the kingdom in case of another Iraqi incursion. He had compelled the Saudi royal family to have him use his Al-Qaeda soldiers to fight off Saddam's soon-to-be invading army, but was passed over in favor of the highly advanced United States military. Through my analysis and research of bin Laden's personality, I firmly believe this is the reason why bin Laden became so infatuated with destroying the United States. He was extremely jealous and felt betrayed that with his nationally renowned name in Saudi Arabia, he was passed over for somebody else. His jealousy and immaturity at simply being told no matches bin Laden's supposed childlike demeanor well at times, which you can read more about in Peter Bergen's fantastic book, The Osama bin Laden I Know. After the terror attacks in the early 1990s, the United States government and CIA began diplomatically pressuring Sudan to expel bin Laden from the country, which they believed bin Laden was using as headquarters to finance and organize terror operations worldwide. This information came from one of the CIA's most valuable Al-Qaeda assets and informants ever, Jamal al-Fadl. Al-Fadl defected from Al-Qaeda in Sudan after he had embezzled funds from the organization. After contacting the CIA's bin Laden unit, he provided them with information that bin Laden was far more than merely a financier of terrorism, but rather an organizer and the military leader himself, as well as his aspirations to acquire dangerous weapons, such as nuclear devices. This set off numerous alarms amongst the US intelligence community, prompting them to threaten the Sudanese government with sanctions that they could ill afford. Bin Laden was expelled, only for him to realize no country in the world would be willing to accept his dangerous activities, except for one: Mullah Omar's Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Although Omar later stated he was simply being a good Muslim by welcoming bin Laden to Afghanistan with open arms, the real reason had to do with money. By 1996, Afghanistan had long been in ruin. Infrastructure was crumbling all around, and they desperately needed funds to rebuild. Bin Laden arrived in Afghanistan in 1996 with just a few bags, along with his closest friend and deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri. But little did Omar and the Taliban know that bin Laden carried a lot more baggage than at first sight. Baggage that would once again plunge the country into war. Chapter 4: Washington's Dilemma. Almost as soon as bin Laden arrived in Afghanistan, he began consolidating his terror organization, setting up training camps to lure disillusioned Arab men to his cause, promising them martyrdom if they closely followed his orders and his outlandish interpretation of the Holy Quran. Although Omar and the Taliban welcomed bin Laden, they promised to leave him alone on one condition: he gave them money. Essentially, Omar had just rented out Afghanistan like an apartment to the fiercest terrorist organization in the world. This mistake would cost the lives of millions of Afghans in years to come. Bin Laden gave empty promises to build Omar and his Taliban associates lavish homes and government buildings. And so, bin Laden continued with what he cared about, which was destroying the United States. From 1996 leading up to September 11, 2001, bin Laden did all he could to attract United States attention. He organized brutal terror attacks in Kenya and Tanzania in August 1998 after al-Qaeda operatives, using truck bombs, blew up the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, murdering hundreds and maiming thousands. United States President Bill Clinton looked on in horror at the White House. He and his government had been reeling from the brutal Oklahoma City bombings in 1995, after an ex-military and white supremacist, Timothy McVeigh, detonated a massive truck bomb that murdered hundreds and cut the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in half. At the time, it had been thought initially by United States intelligence that the terror threat in the United States came domestically, not from Islamic fundamentalism thousands of miles away. They had decided that no non-state organization could ever successfully attack the United States without government support and oversight that would later cost them dearly. Although Clinton's presidency up until 1998 had been very successful domestically and internationally, even brokering the Oslo peace accords between Israel and Palestine, his foreign policy against the growing threat of bin Laden made him squeamish. The charismatic, gray-haired president had endured numerous controversies during his presidency before 1998, but no controversy would line the country up for more bloodshed than his response to the 1998 embassy bombings. Embroiled by a sex scandal with the White House intern Monica Lewinsky, Clinton was hesitant to take out bin Laden, according to Bob Woodward. He had been long paralyzed with anxiety about the ideas of putting U.S. troops on the ground after the disastrous 1993 Battle of Mogadishu and the Black Hawk Down incident. His weapon of choice was a cruise missile or drone strike, but he feared this response out of the risk of murdering innocent women and children. Facing constant bombardment from the press over the sex scandal, Clinton's response, likely to look more presidential, sent more than 60 cruise missiles on August 20th, 1998, towards the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory in Sudan and multiple al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan, based on intelligence that bin Laden might be at one of these camps. Although the strikes hit their targets, Operation Infinite Reach, as it was called, was primarily a massive failure. The Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory, believed by U.S. intelligence to be a site where al-Qaeda may be manufacturing weapons of mass destruction, was merely a pharmaceutical factory. The factory provided Sudan, a country riddled with violence and famine, with nearly 50% of all the country's medicinal remedies against malaria. Even more so of an absurd outcome of this retaliatory strike was that it failed to kill bin Laden and also supposedly killed dozens of civilians. This was precisely what bin Laden wanted, and thousands more wannabe jihadis came in droves to join his cause, including would-be 9/11 hijacker pilot ringleader Mohammed Atta. Chapter 5: Crystal Blue Equation. Infinite Reach further drove bin Laden's cause, and he sought to destroy Americans and Jews wherever possible. But he had long been planning something far more significant in what he called the Plains Operation. At this point, bin Laden was wanted multinationally with a bounty exceeding $5 million, but he heeded no warning and drove forward with his ambitious plan. Bin Laden approved to move forward with the Plains Operation, which had been planned by a close associate of bin Laden named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, aka KSM. After much scaling down of a previous version initially designed by the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, Ramzi Youssef, KSM's nephew, it was decided that multiple hijacking teams, led by Western-educated and wannabe terrorist Mohammed Atta, would travel to the United States. Along with other hijacker pilots accompanying Atta, they would learn to fly commercial airliners and live seemingly ordinary lives to one day hijack them and fly the aircraft into American landmarks such as the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the Capitol building. KSM would provide operational and financial support, as he had once lived in the United States. They would carry out this maniacal and dastardly plot through offshore accounts and a middleman message runner named Ramzi bin al-Shib. Bin Laden made a significant strike on a U.S. destroyer anchored in Yemen in October 2000, which sent United States intelligence departments into a tailspin. It was uncertain where the threat was coming from, but it was obvious one would soon happen in the United States. It was just a matter of when. After two al-Qaeda operatives, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, slipped through the fingertips of the CIA in January 2000 by entering the United States, the attacks of September 2001 had been inevitable. After more than a year of planning and training, al-Qaeda had compiled a total of 19 men, led by Atta, for their mission to destroy these American landmarks. It had cost al-Qaeda a mere $500,000 for al-Qaeda to organize this horrific attack that would take place on September 11, 2001, pennies compared to the nearly $8 trillion and 5 million people killed and the U.S. led war in what would become known as the War on Terror.
We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We're heading to the airport.
We see some particles, also some gray smoke. Now the smoke coming out of the opening appears to be...
Understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that. We don't know if it was a commercial aircraft. We don't know if it was a private aircraft.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Thank you for listening. Please check out the next episode, Desperados, How the United States Lost a War on Terror, in Spotify.